Howdy friends, I have a mug of room temperature black coffee and I'm ready to talk about some archaeology. Hello everyone, my name is Milo and welcome to a new series that I'm going to be starting, which I'm tentatively calling This Month in Archaeology. In this series I'm going to be taking 5 or so archaeological articles that were published within the last month and recap them. They can be from any span of time or any location. I don't really have a specific genre in mind, but they're more going to serve to show you interesting tidbits from archaeology all across the world. And so it is my great pleasure to present to you the very first episode focused on January of 2022. Though I will say that this will be the only installation of this series, assuming the entire planet is annihilated in nuclear hellfire within the next few days. Your time is very important to me. So to make sure you're not wasting it, here is a list of all of the different articles I'm going to be talking about with respective timestamps. So if there's one thing that catches your eye and you only got a couple minutes on your lunch break, you can just skip to that and watch it. But for those of you who just want to go along for the full ride, let me present Our first article is from January 2nd of 2022, and it was published by the Polish Ministry of Education and Science, and discusses a treasure trove of items found in a burial outside the town of Ostrowica in Poland. The burial was found on a small island in a lake, and the deceased is believed to have been a Pomeranian elite. Not like a Pomeranian, like the little fucking rat dog.
Oh, Cynthia's dog. I think it's a Pomeranian. I can't leave him home alone or eats the furniture.
Pomerania is a region in what is now northern Germany and Poland. It stretches inland but runs primarily along the seacoast. The name is derived from the Proto-Slavic words po and morts, which meant along the sea, and it is still a mystery as to why this region was named this. In prehistory, the area was inhabited by a group that we today call the Pomeranian culture. They existed there from about 700 to 150 BCE, and amazingly, they were also known as the Pomeranian face urn culture. I don't know why they decided to go with Pomeranian and Pomeranian. I'm sure there's a reason for that, but I guess they didn't care because they decided to name an entire culture after a face urn. The reason that they got this unusual name is because of the existence of face urns in their material culture, which were burial urns which had human faces on the outside. This may seem like a rather bizarre tradition to us, especially looking at the actual face urns, but it's interesting this tradition cropped up so many times independently in so many different parts of the world. I mean, you have burial sarcophagi in Egypt that have elaborately painted face plates, and of course, you know, Victorian death masks, which are just absolutely terrifying. Humanity has always had a fascination with plastering dead people's faces on their remains. It's rather grotesque, actually. Anyway, back to Pomerania. What the fuck? There's a hole in my pants. Give me a second. That was a less dramatic noise than I was hoping for. I could just change my pants, but I'm not going to because that would be continuity and I don't feel like refilming all of this. I'm sorry you all have to witness this. Yeah, good as new. Yeah, okay. Doesn't impair my mobility at all. Okay, what was I talking about again? Pomerania? Pomerania, that's where I was. In the 960s, the area between the Vistula and Odor rivers was conquered by Duke Mieszko I, or Mieszko. I don't really know, I don't speak Polish. And it was shortly after this, in the 990s, that the area first actually acquired the name Pomerania. The area then fell under very heavy Christian influence and fell under a diocese in about 1000 AD. Then, of course, they got all buddy-buddy with the Holy Roman Empire and were under the leadership of a bunch of Polish dukes up until about the 1700s. But this particular burial dates back to about the 12th century, or the 1100s, which happens to be very shortly after the implementation of Christianity in the area. This burial was found near the town of Ostrowica, which was an important trade hub in the 11th to 14th centuries, and previous excavations in the area have confirmed this, yielding scale weights, as well as coins from Saxons and other parts of Western Europe, or northern Europe. It's up there. You know what it is. You know what it looks like. There's a map. Now, the island on which this burial was found was actually home to another settlement, and a fairly dense one at that. Makes sense to build on an island, and there's even evidence that it was actually connected to the shore by a wooden bridge as recently as about 1160 AD, which does save you the hassle of having to swim home every day or only be able to go home in the winter. And while this is not the first burial to be found in the area, it certainly stands out, because the remains were found alongside some spectacular artifacts. The most impressive of these, in my opinion, being these 2 matching rings carved out of solid amber. The presence of amber in the Baltic material culture dates back nearly 6,000 years, so finding amber in and of itself is not all that groundbreaking. Not only was it seen as incredibly valuable due to its beauty and somewhat scarcity, but it's also fairly easy to work with. It's a rather soft stone, considering it's not actually really a stone, but it's only around a 2.5 on the Mohs hardness scale, which is like around where gypsum is. We know that around this time, much of the amber in the Baltic region actually originated from the town of Sosnice, which is only about 11 kilometers or 6 miles away from where this burial was. Sosnice. Shojnis. So it would make sense, especially as a trading community, that this town would have been part of the amber trade network. Now, we don't know exactly what these rings represent, as they are pretty much just amber bands. But what's really impressive about them is that they are identical. And despite the even though amber is rather easy to work with, the existence of these two artifacts proves that there must have been some very skilled craftspeople who were involved in the amber network at the time. But also, amber was not available to everyone, so the fact that these rings, and two of them, exist in this grave cut means that this person is likely someone of more than just average importance. Just like you are anything but average. But this burial contained more than just these two amber rings. At the feet of the remains found in the grave cut was a bronze bowl, or what was left of the bronze bowl. Bronze doesn't tend to hold up all that well when you bury it in the ground for 1,000 years. But then again, neither would you, so cut it some slack. The bowl actually contains some wooden fragments, which are believed to have been from the coffin that the individual was buried in. I would imagine that the oxidation from the bowl probably had some hand in helping preserve the wood fragments which had fallen into it, so that they didn't just disintegrate in the dirt around it. And we also know that there was fabric included in the burial as well. Not because we found fabric, but because we found the imprints of fabric on the bronze bowl. This could have been a burial shroud, an offering, an article of clothing, we're not really sure, but we do know that it was present. Along with this, there was also an iron knife found still in the remains of a leather sheath. And to speak to the craftsmanship of the area, the leather sheath also had bronze fittings in it. Today is the Super Bowl here in the United States, and my roommates are downstairs doing some Super Bowl festivities. I think they're watching the Puppy Bowl, which for those of you who don't live in America, it's like gladiator sports, but with puppies. It's all the fun of watching a bunch of grown men smash into each other, except they're tiny, cuddly little stuffed animals that give you the overwhelming urge to throw them like a football. The only dogs that can be used to replace a football are Pomeranians.
Fucking dog has fucking papers. Over the line!
That was a joke. The skeleton was also found with 2 pieces of coinage on him, which is rather pleasant because I hear on the road to the afterworld there's a couple tolls. For this exact reason, I have on my will that I'd like to be buried with an easy pass. Are easy passes only a Massachusetts thing? That may be way too niche. Hold on. Okay, Midwestern United States and Eastern United States. It's a little box that you put on your windshield so you don't have to stop at a toll booth. You just go right through and it takes a picture of your license plate, and every time I do, I go, ka-choo! Totally forgot I have tape on my leg. I just reached down because I was like, something feels weird. To lend a little bit more credibility to the status of this individual, archaeologists say that he was buried in a structure that was, quote, the size of a small house. So we don't really know much about him other than the fact that he had sick bling and a huge ego. But from the rings present at the burial, we know that he was likely someone of importance, and we also know that he was likely a Christian. Despite the lack of any material culture consistent with a Christian burial at the site, his burial orientation lends some hints to it. This burial is oriented facing east to west, which is a hallmark of early Christian graves in the area. This, I believe, is due to the belief that when Jesus rises again, it will be happening from the east if you are in Europe. If anyone knows more about theology and Christianity, I would love if you could elaborate a little bit more, but to the best of my understanding, that is the gist of it. But to complicate the matter even further, the east-west burial orientation is also something that is found to be consistent with pagans. Many different traditions throughout the world who will look to the sun as some sort of deity or an indication of a deity will have their burials oriented east to west as a sort of symbolic burial of having the deceased facing the rising sun, which is rather nice, actually. I think that's, oh man, it makes me think of Red Dead Redemption 2. Fuck. I'm not gonna spoil it or anything, but everyone dies. The reason that we are able to imply that this was a Christian burial and not a pagan burial is because at the time this area was under heavy Christian influence. So it's very likely that this burial was an indication of a Christian burial and not a pagan burial. We don't know who this person was, and we likely never will, but I think it's absolutely fascinating to see this tiny glimpse into a person who lived almost 1,000 years ago. And it's certainly fascinating to think about what this man could have been in his life, and what happened to him, and why his rings were so cool, and why I can't have one. Do you like board games? I know I like board games. I'm a big fan of Risk. I love Risk. I always try and get my roommates to play it with me, but they don't, because it's too frustrating and takes too long. What a bunch of fucking losers. Turns out that we are actually not the first people in the world to like board games, because a discovery in Oman published on January 10th has yielded the remains of a 4,000-year-old board game. The dig was led by Piotr Bilinski, who is from the Warsaw Institute of Archaeology, and also Dr. Sultan al-Bukhari, who is the director of antiquities for Oman. The dig was conducted near the town of Ain Bani Sanida, which has a history dating back to the Neolithic period in about 4,000 2500 BCE, or nearly 7,000 years ago if that's the way that your brain works. And it was formerly the location of an important Bronze to Iron Age settlement of the al-Nar culture. This culture existed in what is now Oman in the United Arab Emirates between 25,000 and 2000 BCE, which again is around 4,000 years ago for those of you whose brains work like that. The first evidence of this culture was actually found on an island in the United Arab Emirates, and it is after the name of this island which the culture was given its name. It's very similar to the Monongahela and the Mississippi, where they just end up gaining the name of whatever is there now. It's pretty much a nicer version of finding a new civilization under a parking lot and calling it like the Dunkin' Donuts civilization. I just noticed I'm not wearing my key ring right now, so my belt is just sort of flapping around. I have a solution for this. That was a little better. Oh, it's because I ripped it. That would be why. Tape man. He saved every one of us. What do you do for a living? I put duct tape on myself for people on the internet. The al-Nar culture was an important trade partner between Mesopotamia, the Indus River civilization, and Sumeria, I believe. This particular settlement that's talked about in this article was strategically located between two other major settlements. Those two settlements being Bat and Burami. I do not know if I'm pronouncing those correctly. I am not fluent in Arabic, and as a matter of fact, I'm hardly fluent in anything. What the fuck is going on downstairs? Are people having like a pan fight? Jesus Christ. I do my best at pronouncing things in these videos, but please tell me in the comments if I have any egregious errors because I want to get better at pronouncing things. The Ain Bani Sanida settlement was fairly large for a settlement of the time, and interestingly, it had 4 towers. 4? Are you kidding me? 4! It had 4 towers, and one of them was 20 meters in diameter. The purposes of these buildings are still unknown, whether or not they were dwellings or watchtowers or storage units. We don't really... Storage units? Makes it sound like it's a fucking U-Haul. Either way, we don't really know, but we do know that they had 4 towers. God damn it. I'm sorry about the sound downstairs. I'm probably going to stop filming after I'm done with this section, just so that I can let whatever's happening downstairs settle down. As much fun as it is to listen to my roommates cook. But the towers were not the most important discovery found at this location, because it was in this excavation that they found proof of copper working at the site. Not only was there the remains of refining copper and working with copper, but there was also just copper finished artifacts found there. Professor Belinsky says of this discovery that, quote, "This shows that our settlement participated in the lucrative copper trade for which Oman was famous for at the time, with mentions of Omani copper present in cuneiform text from Mesopotamia." Pretty interesting that the presence of this particular settlement could have actually been discussed in Mesopotamian tablets. But of course, the really fun part is that in the rubble of one of the small buildings on the outskirts, they found a stone board game. It was carved with, and it looks like this. It's not all that exciting, but it's a board game. At the moment, we're not really sure how it's played. There was no evidence of game pieces found with it. And it's also not the oldest board game ever found, which would be the Royal Game of which dates back about 4,500 years. I actually have my own copy right here that I made I think I made this over quarantine, actually, because there was nothing else to do. But the difference between this game and the Royal Game of is that this game was royal. It was found in an area associated with all of the pomp and circumstance of the elite. But this board game was just found in a house of presumably a copper worker or a farmer or a goat herder. It was an average man's game. It would be like finding a game of checkers in a pub. And I think that's what makes this discovery so interesting, is it's so human. With things like the actual discovery of the Royal Game of it looks so beautiful. It deserves to be in a museum. It belongs in a museum.
It belongs in a museum. So do you.
But with a game like this, you can see that it was just done with whatever people had lying around for the sole purpose of entertaining them in their time off. So when you look at this board, don't just think of some slab of stone. Think about a group of friends getting off work and all going over to one person's house, and some of them sitting down and playing a board game 4,000 years ago. These people were just like you and I, and after being exhausted from a long day of work, there's nothing nicer to do than sit down, put your feet up, and have a few beers with the boys. I hope that they eventually figure out how to play this, because they did end up deciphering the Royal Game of which is a fairly simple game, but actually still very fun. There's a great video of the British Assyriologist Irving Finkle talking about it, which I'll try to remember to link in the description because it's a great watch. And Irving Finkle is just fucking hilarious. He looks like the reincarnated bust of a Roman philosopher and is funnier than any Netflix original comedy. But that's enough about old board games. Let's move on to the next. It's a new day, but you don't know that because I'm wearing the same clothes and I'm filming in front of a green screen.
Where is the duct tape, Milo?
But there's now less noise going on downstairs, so I've decided to actually finish this video. You've heard of the war on drugs. It's the cute, kid-friendly name that they gave to the event that should really be known as Nixon's War on Black People, considering that all it really did was fan the flames of the crack and heroin epidemics in the US and also disproportionately affect black people. Calling it the war on drugs is kind of a joke, actually. But today we're going to be talking about a different type of drug war. But in this case, it's a war fought with drugs. An article from January 15th discusses how the Wari Empire in what is now Peru may have used psychedelic drugs in order to gain political influence. So in this case, it was actually the government supplying people with drugs, and thank God that didn't happen. Oh, wait. But unlike the United States, the Wari Empire didn't give their citizens drugs and then hit them with mandatory minimum sentencing for the drugs that they were given by the government. As far as South American indigenous tribes go, I don't hear a lot of people talk about the Wari, so I think it's important that we cover a little bit of what they were all about before we get into their interesting use of recreational drugs. The Wari were a group of people who occupied the Peruvian highlands from about 400 to 1000 CE, meaning that, yes, they predate the far more infamous Incan civilization who would later go on to inhabit the same area. And frankly, the Wari deserve an entire video on themselves because they are an absolutely fascinating culture. But for the sake of this video, I'm just going to give you the spark notes of what you need to know. They, like many other groups in South America, were incredibly skilled farmers. Not only did they have to deal with the rugged Peruvian terrain, but they also mastered the art of irrigation. And due to their complex irrigation systems, they actually managed to survive through the 30-year drought which sealed the fate of the Nazca people who were just to the north of them. Although the end of the Nazca officially came in about 700 CE, when a El Nino event wiped out pretty much everything that they had built. But that was because the Nazca had deforested everything to make land for crops, and then they were hit with that 30-year drought, so everything was just dust waiting to get washed away. So it was multiple things, but either way, these people survived it. And interestingly, the Wari people actually ended up conquering the Nazca after they had been crippled by the 30-year drought El Nino combo move. It's like up, down, left, right, A, B, and then just footage of Hurricane Katrina. The Wari people also had a very strong military presence. And while they did have a very large and complex army, they would frequently turn to diplomacy before turning to the sword. And through this diplomacy, they were able to acquire other smaller groups who lived in the areas around them. Because it's a lot easier to have a bunch of little puppet states loyal to you if you didn't acquire them by going in and murdering all of them. People tend to not look kindly upon things like that. And so by implementing provincial capitals across their land, they were able to control a vast area of Peru and also have control of a wide trade network. But a discovery of the remains of a feast from about 800 CE yields some interesting information as to how they achieved this control. At the former site of this feast, archaeologists found evidence of a beer type of beverage known as chicha. I call it a beer type of beverage because it wasn't like beer as we traditionally know it today, like, you know, cracking a cold Budweiser with the boys. Coors Banquet's where it's at. Instead of being brewed with barley malt like Budweiser or human urine like Natty Light, chicha was brewed with the fruit of the Peruvian pepper tree. When fermented, this small red fruit would create a beverage quite similar to a beer. A little sweet, little bitter, little alcoholic. That's my rapper name. But what is interesting about this particular site is that the chicha had been mixed with vica seeds. And the reason why this is so interesting is because these seeds are known to be psychoactive, meaning that when mixed with the chicha, the drinker was likely not only getting a little bit of an alcoholic buzz, but they were also experiencing mild psychedelic effects as well. But these seeds are nowhere near as powerful as like dropping a tab. So the effect that you'd get with this drink is probably very different than the experience that your Tinder date would tell you that she had with psychedelics as you sit underneath her tool poster and mandala tapestry before noticing in horror the crystals recharging on her windowsill. Yeah, my parents were religious or whatever when I was a kid. They always made me go to church, but I hated it. Anyway, what time were you born? The effects of this drink would likely have been rather mild and would probably have made the drinker feel more relaxed at home and would help build a sense of community atmosphere throughout the banquet. So why are these people doing this if the amount of psychedelics they're taking isn't enough for them to meet God? Well, as I said in the beginning, it is theorized that the reason they did this was to gain political favor. By going to a small satellite community with an offering of food and beer, it was a very good idea to sit down, have a drink with these people, and be able to just relax. Not only are they providing people with a meal and sharing a table with them, but they are also providing them something that lets everyone get a little giggly and have a nice time. A modern equivalent of this would be a presidential candidate who's doing campaigning and just walks into your house and sparks a J in your living room. Now, interestingly, these seeds were actually a very valuable commodity, and they were grown nearly 250 miles away from where they were found at this banquet site. So they clearly clearly went through a lengthy trade process to even get to this place, which not only speaks to the Wari's power and influence, but also proves that they were willing to use these expendable and valuable resources in order to gain more land. But this isn't actually the first time that these psychedelics have been found. The only difference is that most of the other times they've been found, it has been implied that they were used by the Wari elite, perhaps for ceremonial purposes, but either way, they were rather rare and therefore reserved for only the top 1%. Perhaps they were a little bit more common now, or perhaps it was just worth expending the resources in order to gain a little bit more land. It's just like the old saying goes, cash, grass, or hallucinogenic beer. No one rides for free in the Wari Empire. This next article is brief, but you're going to be a big fan of it if you are a Leprechaun or Gold member from Austin Powers.
I love gold so much that I even lost my genitalia in an unfortunate smelting accident.
On January 17th, an article was published discussing a newly found cache of gold coins from Germany. But bear with me, because these aren't just your normal run-of-the-mill Roman coins. I actually didn't even know about this type of coin until reading this article. The discovery was made by Wolfgang Hecht. I'm really trying my best with the German accent. And the discovery contained a cache of 41 coins. There was a few copper ones, some were silver, but a majority of these coins were gold. And as you can see, they're rather interesting looking as far as coins go. This particular type of currency was used by Celtic people about 2,000 years ago. And these type of coins are called, God help me as I try and pronounce this painfully long German word, Regenbogenzuselchen. Regenbogenzuselchen. That's what those are called. God damn it. Which looks like some sort of sick joke in English, but actually means something quite adorable, as this phrase translates to rainbow cups. So why are these lovely little coins called rainbow cups? It's believed that the name of this coinage actually comes from early German farmers, as they would go out in the day and plow their field and till up all the dirt, and then when a rainstorm would come, it would wash the dirt off of the gold coins that were buried in the ground for so many years. And so when farmers would come out after a heavy rainfall, they would find these golden coins littered around their field. And with them came the superstition that this was where the end of a rainbow touched down and dropped gold for them. It was seen as a sign of good luck. There's been many different discoveries of this type of coin before. This one is rather unique just because of the amount of gold coins in it, but I thought it was a really interesting one and I wanted to give you that before going into the last story about On January 26th, a paper was published by Tikva Steiner et al. This is the et al. In question, and it discusses new discoveries found at the Ohalo 2 site. Ohalo 2 is a rather well-known Upper Paleolithic village site along the Sea of Galilee in Israel. Originally, the site was found during a drought because the water level was so much lower and people were walking around and were like, huh, somebody lived here. But because the site was found during a drought, this means that it had been underwater for most of its existence, and that actually worked out quite well because it did a wonderful job of preserving much of the artifacts there, as well as protecting it from development along the shoreline. The village is about half an acre and sustained itself off of hunting, fishing, and gathering. And as far as we know right now, it contains 6 brush huts, 6 open-air hearths, and 1 human grave, according to this quote from archaeologist K. Chris Hurst. And this site dates back a staggering 23,000 years. It's believed that this site was inhabited by the Kabaran culture, who were a nomadic hunter-gatherer group who lived in this area around this time period. The only reason we're even able to define this group of people from this long ago is because they left behind a rich lithic history. So there are many examples of flint tools carved and left behind by these people. Or not carved, napped, but you know what I mean. And this group thrived in the warm period at the end of the last glacial maximum. And what's so interesting about this site and this most recent discovery is that it proves that this group did not only survive in the wake of the changing ice caps, but they thrived in it. While it may seem logical to believe that a warmer climate and the ice caps receding would be a blessing in disguise for many early hunter-gatherer groups, it was actually a very difficult phase shift for many of them. This is because prey began to move and disperse, and many of the systems that they'd become accustomed to hunting in were beginning to be disrupted by the changing climate. Many other groups were struggling to maintain their foothold in this rapidly changing world. The Ohalo 2 group actually managed to diversify their diet and survive off of a wide variety of things in the wake of the glacial maximum. Middens, which are the fancy archaeological word for giant pile of ancient garbage, have yielded the remains of 22,000 animal bones. Of these, some of them were small game, things like foxes and rabbits and fish and birds. 94% of the fish found at the site were from the minnow or carp family, which could indicate that either it was the most prevalent at the time or the people were selectively choosing just this type of fish to eat. We also know that they had a pretty good grasp on fishing because we've also found carved stones that are believed to be sinkers from fishing lines, as as well as the remains of some woven strands, which are believed to be parts of fishing equipment. The bird remains found at the site are all different varieties, from shorebirds and water birds to cliff dwellers and migratory birds. They didn't seem to be all that picky with birds. It seemed like whatever just landed in their front yard was going to be what dinner was. But what's very interesting is the site yielded evidence of wing assemblages, which are pretty much collections of bird wings. And while we don't know exactly what this indicates, it could possibly mean that there was some sort of spiritual activity that accompanied it. Since they just weren't discarded like everyday garbage, it shows that there was some special care taken when preserving or discarding these bird wings. The Paleo through Neolithic periods is an absolutely fascinating time in my opinion, and one of the reasons why I love it so much is because we just know so little about it. So it's really fascinating when a find like this comes out and they find, you know, a pile of bird wings. It really makes you wonder what those people could have been thinking. Was this spiritual belief? Was there some deity associated with it? Is it believed to have brought, you know, good harvest, or, you know, more birds would come by? It's fascinating to think what these people may have intended to keep these assemblages for. If I had a time machine, I would love to go back in time to any group more than 10,000 years ago and just be a fly on the wall to try and piece together what they believed. That would just be fucking fascinating. Anyway, they also found the remains of some bigger game like pronghorns, fallow deer, and gazelles. And the fallow deer and gazelle bones are shown to have been processed in order to remove marrow, which, as we now know in the modern world, is incredibly nutritious. So interesting that they capitalized on this part of it. They really didn't waste anything. Now, since kind of the thesis of this is that these people were doing really, really well in this location, when I got to this point in the paper, I was like, if they are striving to get the marrow out of bones, isn't that kind of an act of desperation? And then I thought about it a little bit more, and I realized that the only reason I'm thinking like that is because we've grown up in a society where we just throw away fucking everything. So it's important to look at this through the lens of a hunter-gatherer society, and not the lens of people who are like, I'm not that hungry anymore, and throw away like a half-eaten burger. If you kill a gazelle, you eat the entire gazelle. It's not an act of desperation, it's just the most logical thing to do. It's the most return on your investment. Now, interestingly, along with all this big game, they also found the remains of tortoises and freshwater turtles that were eaten by this group, which seems really barbaric by our 21st century throwing away half a burger standards, but actually makes just a ton of sense if you're a hunter-gatherer group. I mean, a turtle and a tortoise are both really slow, and you can eat them, so why would you not eat them? And the shells of these turtles and tortoises found at the site were all of a more or less uniform size, leading some scientists and archaeologists to believe that turtles and tortoises may have been selected for their shell size by the group that lived there. And just like any diverse diet should have, along with all the meat, there was also the remains of grain. Archaeologists found different grindstones in different huts, and with them the remains of things like barley, wheat, and oats, or their wild variants, I suppose, but still grains, or cereal grains, I guess. And interestingly, different grindstones had the remains of different grains found along with them, leading some people to believe that there was maybe not an assembly line, but certain areas were dedicated to a certain type of grain. These distinct production zones suggest that people were not just surviving at this site, but, as I said verbatim earlier, thriving at this site. I would love to know more about this, and information about this site is still coming out. It's still being researched, so I'm sure there will be an update on this in a future episode, but I'm on the edge of my seat for this one. This one is absolutely fascinating. It's a very, very unique window into Neolithic life that we rarely get to see. Now, since you are seeing this halfway through February, and I'm going to try and be more punctual about these episodes in the future, let me give you a little sneak peek as to what one of the articles in the next episode is going to be on. If you were interested in the story of the Wari and their psychedelic beer juice, you're going to love the stories about them threading human spines onto reeds. That was an article that was published earlier in February, and I cannot wait to talk about it, but that'll be in the next episode. If you're interested in what I do here and want to keep up to date with all my videos in the future, make sure to subscribe. The links to all of my various social medias are in my description for my Instagram and my Discord and my Patreon if you feel oh so generous. I'd like to thank my patrons for making this video possible. Your names will be in the credits if you'd like to see them. Stick around for that. Remember to stay curious, stay inquisitive, and most importantly, remember not to mix psychedelics with beer because it's a waste of money.